We are live for this fourth conference of the 2022 Content Summit with Jimmy from Superpath. Hi, Jimmy. How are you today?
Hey, Dami. Good. How are you? Happy to chat with you today.
Yeah, me too. Amazing. For the people that have been with us since the beginning, I hope you enjoyed the discussion with Alison, Melissa, and Anthony. For the people who just joined us, welcome. I'm Domi, VP Marketing at PlayPlay. PlayPlay is a video creation platform for content, marketing, and communication teams. We are used by more than 2,000 companies in the US and in Europe. It's actually the second year we host the Content Summit in Europe, but it's the first time we do it in the US. And I'm thrilled to have Jimmy with us for this first edition. All of our content managers are actually using the Superpath community and getting really great insights from this community. So maybe a few words about you, Jimmy, before we start. Let
Yeah,
me know if I forget anything. You are the CEO and co-founder at Superpath. Superpath is a content community and a job board, and you actually have 10,000 members. Is it correct?
that's correct. Yes.
Yeah, impressive. And prior to Superpath, I think you've been a long time B2B content marketer. You led growth and content in scale ups like Animals, Vero, or QuickBooks. I think you actually know pretty well Ali from Animals, who will be speaking at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. Ali's fantastic.
And you both live in Colorado. That's
Yep.
funny. So yeah, on the more personal side, you live in Colorado with your wife and 19-month-year-old daughter, and a dog. So you're a dog
Yeah. Can't
lover.
forget the dog. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see your dog in a picture
Oh
right
yeah, there
behind
she
you.
is, right here.
And you're also, I believe, a runner. You're a trail runner. You actually just did the Leadville 100 trail race. So if there are any runners or dog lovers in the chat, we can relate with Jimmy. Um, okay, so we have almost 40 minutes together with Jimmy. I have a lot of questions for him, but please make sure that you ask your own questions in the Q&A session so Jimmy can answer those too. So let's start. Jimmy, maybe as a first and easy questions, why did you create Superpath, this content community in the first place?
Yeah. Well, see, I started it about 3.5 years ago, and at the time, I had just caught wind of this trend of Slack communities,
Mm-hmm.
and I went looking around for one in the content marketing space, and I didn't find anything. And I was really intrigued by this idea of being able to chat with my peers who worked at different companies kind of in real time. And so I thought, I don't know, I'll just make one and see if anybody joins it. So I made the community. It was called the Content Career Growth Community back then, which was a mouthful. And we later changed it, obviously. And I sent an email to, I don't know, 10 people I knew in content marketing and just said, hey, do you guys want to kind of collect here and share ideas? And there was definitely a career focus early on. I wanted to
Okay.
create a forum where people could talk openly about challenges they were having in their jobs, career aspirations, skills they were trying to develop to help them get to the next level, maybe even pay. Um, and from there, things actually happened very quickly. I was really surprised that that core group of like 10 or so people, many of whom are still in there and contributing, started inviting more people. And then one thing led to another. I had no intention of ever turning it into a business. I thought it would just be a kind of a place to hang out. Um, and we can go into the founding story of the business part of it if you'd like, but the gist of it is basically I thought, I think there's something here. I think this could be the seed of something really cool. What would happen if I spent 40 hours a week on it instead of 30 minutes? And here we are 3.5 years later, still doing it.
Well, impressive. So basically, you just created the community you were dreaming, you were dreaming about.
Basically, yeah.
So yeah, you've been leading this content marketers community for quite a few years now. Have you, like, let's say, seen an evolution and either the profile of people joining the group, or either the type of conversations that people are having there?
Mm, yes and yes. And I can speak to both of those, both the
Yeah.
people who have joined and the type of things that folks want to talk about. Um, when we initially launched the community, it was really focused on fairly senior content marketers. So these are
Mm-hmm.
people who are like managers, directors, or even VPs who wanted to come and talk about, like I mentioned, career stuff, but like problems very specific to folks who are maybe like 8 to 10 or 12 years into a career. Um, but we never restricted it to that. And so, like as the community grew, we attracted all types of content marketers. So some VPs, some fairly junior people, and that's been great actually because we get a really wide range
Yeah.
of sort of career development in that group, and also it allows the more senior folks to sort of give back in a way. Like if a more junior person has a career type question, like there's some really qualified people who have been doing this for 10 plus years who can jump in and answer those kind of things. So that's been really cool. In addition to that, at a certain point, I don't remember when exactly, somewhere around a few thousand members, we started attracting a lot of freelancers. And the group had been created for in-house content marketers. In retrospect, it makes sense that we would start to attract freelancers because this is their clientele, basically. Like the freelance crowd wanted to come and see what all these in-house people are talking about, and we had
Mm.
channels where people could talk about, finding freelancers or freelancers who were wanting to pick up projects, and pretty naturally became a place where people could source talent, find work, and that kind of thing. And we've leaned really heavily into that. Like now we have programs developed around that. And then in terms of the type of things that people talk about, it started with this focus on career. I would say the career stuff, skills, pay, kind of dealing with day-to-day challenges at work is still at the forefront of what we do and the things that people are talking about. And we really try to keep a safe space for people to ask questions related to those topics. But now there's a lot of conversations about content strategy. Like our busiest channel is our strategy channel, and people have a wide range of questions, really interesting questions. Hard for me to even summarize what happens there because there's so much happening. In addition to that, people are talking about the tools and apps that they're using, workflows. There's quite a bit of SEO discussion, which is, I guess, just a natural extension of content marketing.
Mm.
Um, and then local, we've tried to organize local groups too. So we have a number of local channels where folks can try to connect with people who live close to them as well. So it's really, the surface area has increased quite a bit over the last couple of years.
Okay, super interesting. And in terms of companies type for the in-house content marketers, do you have a good mix of B2B and B2C? And do you see a difference in the themes that people want to talk about
Hmm.
between those? Yeah, that would be interesting to know.
That's a great question. It's primarily B2B SaaS.
Okay.
I bet 80 to 90% of the folks who join are B2B SaaS, either on the in-house side or they're freelancers
Mm.
who work in that world as well. Um, Not a huge representation of B2C or D2C folks. We do have a channel for B2C. And to be honest, it's one of our quieter channels. I don't know if that means we just haven't reached those people yet, or content marketing is just primarily a B2B thing. I will say that when we see threads popping up in the B2C channel, it's often um, like the type of content that those companies do is quite different. Like there's a heavier emphasis on social, for example,
Mm.
whereas the B2B folks are much more, in general, much more interested in like long form, building organic traffic, and the unit economics of that don't stack up quite as well for B2C. Like a B2C company probably isn't spending thousands and thousands of dollars to create a single piece of content if they're selling $20 SKUs. Whereas it makes a ton of sense for a B2B enterprise company with annual contract values of $20,000, So I feel like they end up with very different problems. And I would love to have more B2C folks. It's the world I don't actually really know that much about. So if they're out there, we should we should
Join.
be doing more to reach them. Yeah.
But maybe that's a good learning, that when you're building a community, you, of course, you want to be broad because you want to have a lot of people there, but at some point, if you want to have relevant discussions between people, you need to also stick to a particular niche. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that that's true. I mean, um, I'm sure there's a Superpath kind of equivalent for the B2C folks where they can gather and have much more like relevant discussions. Like if they joined our group, they might be like, this isn't really what's top of mind for me.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there's that. Uh, in addition to that, one other just quick thing I'll add is that uh, one thing that we've noticed over the years is that the more senior folks, that was sort of our uh, the little bit of momentum that got our snowball rolling, became quieter as the group expanded. And so we've just recently created a locked private channel that you have to apply for
Mm.
VPs and directors. And that's like another
Super
way that we're trying to
interesting.
create a safe space. So if folks want to be part of that, there's just a simple application they have to fill out. Basically, we just want to verify that the term VP or director is in their uh, LinkedIn profile, essentially. And then that channel is a whole different set of questions, different topics. And
Mm.
so I imagine there may be other things that we do like that to maintain some level of exclusivity, even as the majority of the community is open to everybody.
So there are secret channels in
Yeah,
Superpath.
yeah, there are.
So yeah, I was asking this because in the world of content marketing and mostly in the B2B SaaS world, we hear more and more about building a community and how content marketers should start having and building their own community. And a lot of companies that has nothing to see to do with a community and that sell a product or service are trying to launch this community. So yeah, what do you think of this? Do you think it's a good content strat and marketing strategy? Who should do this in a company? Should it be in the hands of content and comms managers? And how do you start this huge project of launching a content community?
Yeah, those are great questions. Interesting. Just a couple of weeks ago, I tweeted out like if anybody works at a B2B SaaS company and runs a community, like let's talk. Like I'll offer you whatever advice I can. I don't know exactly how relevant it'll be, but let's talk and I'll give you whatever ideas I have to throw your way. So I've had about 5 calls with B2B SaaS companies who run communities, and I've learned a
Mm,
lot in talking with them. One thing I learned
nice.
is just that Superpath as an independent community, we're not tied to a SaaS product. We have a handful of lines of business, but we have a lot of freedom in the way that we operate. I can always just do what's best for the community, and in general, that rising tide lifts all ships. The more
Yeah,
engaged and happy the community is, the better our business does. It's not exactly true for B2B SaaS companies. There's always this emphasis on tying the activity and the investment and the time back to
of
a
course.
business objective, as there should be. And it creates some constraints for the folks who are running the communities. One thing I've discovered in these calls is that SaaS communities tend to be kind of a melting pot of a few different things. And at first, I felt like that meant that these communities sort of lacked a focus or a vision. But I think I've changed my mind on that. I think it's kind of a good thing. And I'll give you an example. So um, there's one SaaS community that I joined actually, and it's a mix of um, customer support,
Hmm.
product marketing, where the SaaS company's product team is just helping to like introduce features to the users, give people ideas on how to use the product. They do it in a way that doesn't feel salesy. It's more just
Sounds
like, hey, did you know you could do this? And oftentimes I'm like, oh, I didn't actually. That's helpful. So it's very like kind of like how to tutorial style content. Um, and then there's also this kind of like professional development angle that gets baked into pretty much all these communities where folks they do want to talk about their jobs. They want to talk about some of the challenges they're facing with um, growing their team, uh,
like.
dealing with maybe a manager who's giving them some grief. A lot of these communities, they do want to talk about salary. They want to share open roles. Like that stuff kind of ends up becoming part of every community I've noticed. Um, if you don't have a community, I would recommend not starting with the melting pot. Like pick one thing, and really try to get that one thing up and running first.
Mm.
There's a company called Launch Notes that we work with at Superpath. They run a Slack community called Launch Awesome. I think it's fantastic. They're in their first iteration of building it out, and it's very focused on education. They do very little product marketing, so it's more about like they run office hours. They They create a lot of content for the community. I think they're still trying to see like where is this going to go, but the community is very engaged and it's growing. I think that's really cool. I chatted with another company just recently called ChartHop. Their community is all about cohort based learning. So every like month or two, they put together a cohort. They run them through like a sort of like a small group workshop style thing where everybody gets to learn about the same topic at the same time. Um, Obviously, there's some product stuff mixed in with that, like
Of course.
here's how to execute this thing using our product as part of it. There's, I don't know, hopefully these are helpful examples. Lattice is one of the most successful SaaS communities I've ever come across. Last I checked, they have 15,000 or more human resources managers as part of that community, and they do a ton.
How is it called, their community?
It's called Resources for Humans.
Resources for Humans. Okay, great.
And you actually do have to work in human resources to get in. I tried to apply and they didn't let me in. But from what I've heard, so actually the human resources person that was on our team at Animals was she introduced me to it when I started this Slack group, and she was like, you got to check this one out. It's amazing.
Okay.
It's huge. And then they started running events. So they started doing virtual meetups, and they actually ran a conference. They do local meetups. So there's different flavors of this kind of thing. I think in many ways, those things are an extension of the company itself. And I think that's probably true of community in general. Like companies that do really well with content marketing tend to be rooted in the philosophy of educating people, just generally being helpful. They sort of see content as a way to connect with people and less of a way to just convert, and I think the same is true for community, maybe even more so because it's so difficult to track whether or not engagement in the community results in signups for a trial or a demo. So there's a certain sort of company culture profile that I think is probably primed for this kind of thing. And then there's a certain type of company which maybe is really focused on like if your primary growth mechanism is paid ads, community is going to be a tough transition for you because all the things you do to grow the company in that way are not going to translate very well. So long answer, but I think, pick one way to start. I think it's okay to add more things in over time, but figure the one thing out before you try to scale it.
To conclude on this subject, we have one question from Ollie. What are the benefits for a company that sells a product or a service to launch its own community?
That's interesting.
Hidden advertising.
I think it depends on the product. Actually, I think you should come back to the product. So like as an example, if you think about the way that open source communities run, it's all very product focused. Like people are there either to contribute or learn about or use the product. And I think that for a certain type of company, that makes a lot of sense. So trying to think of a good example, like a company like Airtable. I don't know if they run a community or not, but it's a product that's incredibly flexible, has basically infinite use cases, can be actually quite overwhelming if you've never used it before. They could run a product community, I think, because it's all about inspiration, tutorials, just like getting people involved in using the product and that type of thing, whereas say you're in, professional services and like you run an agency, for example, you've got no product to speak of. So in that case, it's more about like bringing people together and engendering trust within those people. You know what I mean? Like the value you create could be as simple as a safe space for people to communicate with each other, or, an opportunity for networking or whatever. In general, I think that over the long term, whatever way you provide value is quite likely to come back to you. Like the return is likely to be there. It's going to be really difficult to measure. I know that there's some tools coming out to help people do that. Like CommSor is one I've looked at recently, CommSor. That's sort of like a community ops tool. It includes a bunch of interesting analytics and stuff like that. So I hope that's helpful, Ollie.
Yeah, definitely. One last question about community, and then we will move on to another content subject, but apparently it interests the audience. Tony says, I've seen the term community used very broadly. So what would you say really makes up a community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I sometimes think of a community as like it's Slack, basically. Like
Slack, yeah.
If a SaaS company runs Slack that's open to people that are not their employees, that's a community, but it really is so much more than that. Some companies have been doing community long before anyone was creating Slack communities, and they were probably doing it through newsletters. Maybe they were doing it through podcasts. I mean, in many ways, content marketing is an amazing way to build community. I think that the thing that makes it, when I think of a community now, I think of peer-to-peer communication. That's the
Yeah.
main thing. So while there are ways that content or podcasts or other things like that could help grow communities, I think that in order for it to really be a community, individuals have to be able to communicate directly with each other and not just you talking to everybody.
Yeah. So peer to peer, super important. And
Yeah,
yeah, mainly Slack group when it comes to SaaS, B2B SaaS communities.
probably. Yeah. I mean, there are amazing tools out there. Um, uh, Mighty Networks, Circle, Podia, they're
Yeah.
teachable. There's so many. There's so many good ones. Slack has a lot of flaws. There's a lot of challenges with running a community on Slack, but it's often a good choice just because people are already there.
And so while we were speaking about, like new trends and content marketing trends, there is also another buzzword, I think, which is media-led growth, meaning a lot of companies that has nothing to do with a media are asking their marketing team or content team to build a media. And in the process of doing so, they often consider building a microsite. And I'm actually speaking about this because you wrote a really insightful LinkedIn post about the downsides and the good sides of this strategy. You actually
Yeah.
gave some successful examples like Increment by Stripe. But before you arrive to that level, right? It's probably a long way. So what do you think about this?
About microsites specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually not much of a fan of microsites. And the reason is not that they can't work. It's just that I've seen so many of them die on the vine. People sort of dream like this is how I saw this play
Can
out.
you define a microsite for the audience
Sure,
just to
like a
make sure?
microsite is typically like a sort of a purpose-driven section of the site dedicated to content. So it might be like, academy.saaswebsite.com, something like that, and
Mhm.
so it's kind of this one-off this one-off content effort for like one very specific purpose. And oftentimes it's used for like more broad education than it is like product focused stuff. Um, the way that, so like in my time at Animals, I did a lot of sales. So over the course of 2 years, I was probably on 250 sales calls, and microsites come up a lot, like a surprising amount. And I think that the challenge that I always had with them was like, these companies would tell me why their current content marketing isn't working very well. And their idea is, hey, let's build a microsite. I generally felt that, sort of applying that same effort to fixing their primary content strategy would be a much better effort, much better use of their time rather than starting something completely new. Because what happens is, you've got to build the site, you have to design it, you have to scope it out. It takes longer than you think. You have to, assign out the work and edit it. And there's really a lot that goes into it. And then it needs to be maintained and promoted and distributed. You need to figure out how the linking structure works. Like there's a lot there. And for companies who did do it, I just noticed like a sense of fatigue eventually, like 6 months
Mm.
into a microsite, most people are sick of it, and it hasn't really accomplished what they wanted it to because it ended up being so much more work than they originally imagined. So in general, I think that effort is probably best applied to, if you have a blog, put it there. There's also this trend, which a guy named Kevin Lee, who runs marketing at Oyster, wrote about, I think very eloquently in his newsletter, that he calls the blog plus trend. I think this is a good trend. So like most SaaS companies now, they have a blog plus other content resources on the site. So they may have like a resource center. That's where the ebooks and webinars live. They may have a podcast, and there might be the / podcast subfolder contains all of that
Mm.
content. So now there's multiple avenues for content, but it all lives under the same root domain. I mean, I guess you could like loosely compare those to microsites, but I actually think it's much, much easier to maintain that type of thing than it is to maintain separate microsites.
Mm. But blogs and ebooks, I mean, of course, you need to have those probably, but still, do you think that they are other channels and new formats that marketers could use to educate the market in a more innovative way? And okay, not
Mhm.
microsites, but what else?
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. I think I've seen. I'll give you a few examples of things I've seen. One thing we're actually trying at Superpath is user generated content. I think that's a pretty under-tapped resource. Our version of it is fairly career focused. So we have a thing called the 100K Club, and if you're a content marketer and you make more than $100,000 a year, you can join our 100K Club, and it's an anonymous interview. We ask you a series of questions. We ask you to share your salary
Mm,
publicly, and then just talk about like how did you get there, what do you do, stuff like that. It's been really successful for us. I've got to think there's other ways for SaaS companies to tap into user generated content. Um, Another thing I saw recently, and I'm blanking on the company I saw this from, is they were creating Notion workbooks, um, and the goal was they were using it was a lead gen tactic. They would write about like, for example, they'd write about content strategy, and then in order to get the template, or they called it a workbook because it was a template with some education. Instead of it being a PDF ebook, or instead of it being like a Word doc checklist, it was a Notion workbook, which you could actually get in and just start using really quickly. I thought that was pretty slick. Um, and then I think that there's a lot of room for companies to improve with thought leadership. I feel like that's one of those things that companies talk about a lot, but typically don't
yeah,
execute on very well. And like the version of it that I think is uh, probably most helpful is just to use thought leadership as an opportunity to just share things that are happening within the company. You know what I mean? That sounds really obvious, but if you can extract internal subject matter expertise and package it up in a way
of
that it can
course.
be accessible to everybody else, that's really, really
Mm.
valuable. It doesn't have to be this like magical kind of fancy strategy. It's really as simple as like taking people along the journey as the company grows and your ideas and goals and vision for it change, and just sort of bring folks along with that. So like that's tried and true, but also I think generally not executed on very well.
Yeah. We actually have a great presentation later on with Ashley from Atlassian about thought leadership. So that's a great
Awesome.
transition. But back to user generated content, because I think that's indeed a very powerful trend. I think I read it was on a Hotsuite blog that it was like 93% of marketers agree that consumers trust content created by customers more than
Mm.
content created by brands. I mean, it seems obvious, but do you have concrete examples of great user generated contents and tips for content marketers listening to us if they want to do some content like this?
Yeah, that's a great thought. I think that the way that we do it works very nicely for our community because we're in the same vein of that the thought leadership idea. We're trying to extract knowledge that already exists and just package it up in a way
But
to
if
make
you
it
don't
really
have a
accessible to people.
community, how do you do it if you don't have a
That
community?
I think that um, data analysis is a really good way. So
Mm,
um, uh, there's a company we work with called Verblio. They publish an annual, they call it their digital content report. It's a big survey that they run. They get an insane amount of data. They analyze it, put together all the charts and graphs and publish it. That's user generated content in a sense. I mean,
of course.
they're just reporting on what all of their customers and subscribers are telling them. So I think that's a really good way to do it. Um, it can be in the form of an annual benchmark report. That's a big lift. Their team told us it took them 6 months to go from the day they kicked off the project to the day they published it. That's a lot of time. There's another way to do that, which actually we've dabbled with at Superpath, which is that we run micro surveys. So we'll run a survey in our email list or in the Slack group, which I feel like most companies could do that with whatever audience they already
Yeah,
have.
the
And I
users.
figure if we have, yeah, and it's meant to capture sentiment more than it is to capture like really quantitative data. So we might say like we did a survey once on what are the most frustrating things at your job, and we collected a small amount of data from that, but it was more like we just got anecdotes from people, and we published some of that stuff, and it really resonated with people because people say, oh my gosh, like my manager does the same thing, it drives me crazy. And so the content we would like create it from the list and then share it right back to the list.
Mm.
Again, trying to share the sentiment more than the data. But then we would also just like pull from that. We would learn so much from it, and then that would give us ideas for future content. So I think that's another way to potentially do it. And then one other way, which is difficult, but probably worth doing, is contributed content, where you have people write content for you. Maybe you even ghostwrite it on their behalf. So it's their ideas, it's their words. You just kind of handhold them through it, or even actually like type it out yourself, you know.
Mm.
Some companies do a really amazing job of that. Like Clearbit did
Yeah.
this amazingly well. They did two versions of this. One was called data-driven marketing. Another was called data-driven sales. These are huge content efforts. It was all built around contributed content. And from my behind the scenes knowledge, I know that a lot of that was actually Clearbit doing the heavy lifting. So it's, they bring in, you know, experts on the topic, but they do the work to help them
Mm.
get the content into a place where it's ready. So it's really easy for them. So,
Yeah.
you
That
know, I'm
resonates
sure there's
a lot.
many other examples. Yeah.
No, definitely. And I mean, that's funny because at PlayPlay, one of our ad that works the best, it comes from user generated content. Basically, it's an ad that says you are a content marketer, not a video editor, and that's okay. And that's
Hmm.
something that we've heard in a survey. So that's definitely resonates. And I want to make sure that we have the time to actually talk about your big yearly report that you have at Superpath, because you actually do, I think it's a salary report, right, every year about content marketing. So
Yes.
can you share with us like the main learnings you have of this year report, salaries, paid gaps, whatever you have?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. There's a lot there. I would say, in general, content marketers are being paid pretty well. That was like what
That's
my
good
primary
news.
takeaway from that. On average, the average annual income, not, excuse me, it's not all salary because some folks were freelancers.
Okay.
Average pre-tax annual income was $93,000 of the 400 or so people that we surveyed. Um, there's obviously some significant discrepancies within that. So we looked at a few things. We looked at in-house content marketers, who we defined as people who make more than 50% of their income from a salary. Those people make about $91,000 a year on average. And then we looked at freelancers who make more
Mm-hmm.
than 50% of their income from freelance work. That was our kind of loose way of defining the difference, because a lot of people dabble with both. Those folks make about $94,000 a year. Again, pre-tax, so they have some expenses and other
Of
things they have
course.
to account for, but that's their top line. In both cases, that was up about 10% year over year, which was up about 10% over the prior year. So steady increases on both
Mm-hmm.
fronts. We also looked at salary by experience and salary by title, and we found that folks who are senior, have the word senior or the word director in their title, make between like $110,000 and $140,000 a year. Sorry, I'm looking at the data right now so I can give you the accurate um, accurate numbers. So a lot of good there. Definitely some bad too, though. We found significant pay discrepancies between men and women, and between uh, people who are Caucasian versus people of color.
Wow.
Some pretty disappointing stuff in there. I think it's really important that we get like we have the data, and two, we talk about it.
Of
Probably
course.
the worst stat we found was that Caucasian content marketers make on average about $22,000 more than folks who are Black, Indigenous, or of color. Um, that's really bad.
That's
I mean,
that's a
twenty two
huge
thousand
gap.
dollars is a significant gap,
Yeah.
and we lay out all the data that we found within this within the survey. So
Okay.
my suggestion is, if you work in the world, go look at it. You know, see how your salary stacks up against this, and you know, we encourage everyone in our community to take this to your boss if you
Mm.
feel that you're underpaid, particularly if you're on the bad end of a pay discrepancy. Like, go to them and say, look, this is what my white or male counterparts make. This is unfair. Fix this. And here's the data to prove it. You know what I mean? Um, Interestingly, we got some pushback from a handful of folks who run content teams, because their teams were coming to them complaining about not making enough money. Um, and our response to that was, sorry, pay them back. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Like, these people have great options. The content
Yeah.
marketing industry is thriving right now. There's amazing opportunities, even though like our sort of macroeconomic climate is feels very uncertain right now. Like we're getting amazing jobs posted, people are getting paid. So I would
Mm.
encourage people to check it out and just sort of
Yeah,
check your own teams or your own salary against it.
Kira actually shared the link in the chat. Thank you so much for doing this. We have 4 more minutes. So maybe one question from Carla to open our chakras. She's asking what new professions you think could pop up soon in the content world, I guess.
Mm,
Repurposing manager, metaverse content manager, whatever.
yeah, super. I think that artificial intelligence, I think, is the direction that this is all heading, and I think that um, uh, I've played around with some of these tools. Jasper, Copy AI, Writer.com, I've been super impressed with. But in all cases, they need someone to run the tools and to train them. And I think that that will probably be a dedicated role at some point. And I think it's a fairly obvious one because if you're able to train a tool like Writer, you as a single person will be able to operate at such a massive scale. Like for example, if you have 5,000 blog posts on your site, you could rewrite the meta descriptions for each post in 5 minutes, if the tool is trained up properly. But someone
Yeah.
is going to have to own the tool. They're going to have to make sure they understand how it works to train it properly. You know, um, I'm pretty amazed at what these tools can do, not just in terms of like sort of being trained up to actually produce really quality work, but also to sort of create boundaries, right? So you can put in your style guide, like you can build a style guide, an AI style guide, which will automatically sort of streamline
Mm.
your brand team's work. For example, there's just so many interesting use cases. I actually just read an article just yesterday about how the team at UiPath is using AI. And I can't remember where I saw that, but I can try to find a link. Fascinating because they were operating at massive scale, and this allowed them to move really, really fast. So I feel like, yeah, we'll definitely have dedicated AI content folks in the future.
Okay, so to conclude on this, what skills do you think content managers should focus on if they want to make sure to be still on point in the coming years?
I think that we're always going to need people who can write really well, who can tell
Of
stories and drive narrative. I think that one thing that we've seen over the past couple of years is that a lot of in-house content managers don't do very much writing. A lot of that is being outsourced to freelancers and marketplaces and agencies. And so I think it's possible that if you want to be a writer and you want to be a very high level individual contributor, you may need to head that direction, so the agency or freelance route to
yeah.
pursue that. And I think that that's noble if that's what you want to do. And for the in-house folks, it's going to be a lot more about developing um, a mix of new skills. So there'll be some soft skills, just like the ultimate soft skill is just, can you get stuff done? Like,
Mm.
can someone throw you a kind of hairy, thorny project and trust that you're the person who can
You
take it
will
to the finish line?
execute. Mm.
Exactly. And then there's some hard skills too, like data analysis. I think all content marketers should be honing there at the very least, if not SQL, at least their Excel skills. You got to be a whiz in a spreadsheet because you've got to be able to understand data, which we now have more and more and more of in order to make good decisions. So
Mm. Okay,
the
great.
in-house role is changing quite a bit, and it's a lot less about writing and a lot more about all the other things that make a content program thrive.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. That was super interesting. Time has been running super fast. Um, have a great day, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Dami. Great to chat, and thanks, folks, for coming.
And see you in 2 minutes with everyone with Thibaut, our CEO, who will talk about video and in-house content creation. So that's a good transition.
Perfect.
Thank you, Jimmy. Bye bye.
Thanks. Take care.